Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Jerusalem Fund and our educational program, the Palestine Center. My name is Selma Shawa, and I'm an intern here at the Palestine Center for the summer. With everything going on right now in Palestine, from Gaza to Jerusalem and to every single part of Palestine, we the interns at the Palestine Center found it very important to talk about the media and the role that the media plays in portraying the Palestinian people and the struggle of the Palestinians as a whole, whether they're in Palestine or if they're abroad and in the diaspora. We also really wanted to portray what gets into the media and what's hidden, what's unleashed, what's not, and which sides play the most important role in giving this image to the world. In our lecture series, which is titled the Media's Distortion and Misrepresentation of the Palestinian Issue, we hope to explore the full scope of media bias and its effects on both readers and viewers as a whole, and also those involved in the conflict themselves and those suffering as a consequences of what's happening there. And for this purpose, we invited media analyst Omar Baddar, who is going to be the keynote speaker for our lecture series, and he's going to provide an overview of the subject as a whole. And as someone who has spoken publicly about the Israeli bias, Baddar is very uniquely positioned to detail his experience and explaining how Palestinians are marginalized as a consequence of the media biases. Omar Baddar is a political analyst, he's a digital producer, and he's also a human rights advocate. He's also the deputy director of the Arab American Institute, and he's going to detail his work in combating the misrepresentation of the Palestinians in the media. Baddar holds an MA in International Relations and Comparative Politics from the University of Memphis, where his research focused primarily on U.S. Middle East policy. He's the former executive director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee of Massachusetts and the former director of the Palestine Cultural Center for Peace in Boston. He's also participated in dozens of panels, lectures, and debates on college and university campuses throughout the U.S. His media appearances have included the BBC, Al Jazeera, Sky News, Voice of America, Russia Today, and many other different panels. And he's also written on a lot of different platforms as well. So this is why we knew right away that Omar Baddar would be the perfect fit for our lecture series, and we were very delighted that he accepted our invitation. So without further ado, let's all welcome Omar Baddar.
Thank you very much, Salma, for a very kind introduction, and to the Palestine Center for hosting me, Dana, Selma, Khadija, and Liam, especially for putting together this series and for the invitation. I think that watching the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on television for anybody who's informed about the subject can be a very frustrating experience. Frustrating first and foremost because of what is actually unfolding on the ground. There is occupation, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and a situation of injustice that is absolutely infuriating. And so when you watch it, that's a natural source of frustration. And I think that frustration is then compounded when you look at how mainstream American media coverage of this issue fails to convey to the average viewer what is actually really going on. And the primary way that happens is because of missing context, and primarily the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. Without that context, nothing in the conflict makes sense. So the story typically runs: Palestinian youth throw rocks at Israeli soldiers then open fire, killing a couple of them, and the entire debate is on whether the soldiers overreacted, whether it was disproportionate. But what is actually missing is the fact that the soldiers do not belong there in Palestinian towns in the first place. They are an illegal occupying force. And so that is the first act of aggression, not the rock throwing. It's the fact that these soldiers are there in the first place. You know, if somebody broke into your home tonight with a gun and then a scuffle ensued between the two of you, that intruder could not claim the right to self-defense in your home. And in exactly the same sense, Israel can no more claim the right to self-defense in the Palestinian territories than that intruder can in your home when they're fighting against the rightful owners and residents of that home. Or take, for example, the events that are currently unfolding in Jerusalem. You know, there was a Palestinian attack on some security guards, then there were new metal detectors that were placed there, and now there's this whole debate about the protests. Don't the metal detectors make sense? Isn't there a security concern? But if you take a moment and just flip the scenario around, imagine if some attack happened in Tel Aviv, and then the Palestinian Authority deployed armed security guards and metal detectors around Tel Aviv. Nobody would be talking about whether these measures make sense or don't. Everybody would be talking about what on earth does the Palestinian Authority think that it can possibly deploy armed security guards in an area that does not belong to the Palestinians. But that is not the first question that is asked about the events that are currently unfolding in Jerusalem. The first question ought to be, when you turn on the television, is armed illegal occupiers setting up security checkpoints around areas that don't belong to them. That is the starting point. So you take the occupation away, and suddenly this basic understanding of what is actually taking place and what the driving force of this conflict is becomes missing, and without it, you lose everything. Another issue is the unequal value on human life that we see. Now, I don't want this to be mistaken for individual cases where a media outlet reports something that is unfair to the Palestinians, or reports by mistake something that is unfair to the Israelis, and then they issue a correction. These incidents can be pulled by anyone in any direction, but I'm talking about something much more systemic, of how are casualties portrayed. And you'll notice that time and again, Israeli casualties, which happen far less frequently, are very well humanized, and they should be humanized. You've got pictures, you've got the names, you've got the background stories. And by contrast, Palestinian casualties, when they do occur, they're very often statistics that run at the bottom of the screen. That many Palestinians were killed, and we move on. And I think one of the more egregious examples of the disparity in how the media values different lives is this headline from the Washington Post, which was posted 3 years ago during the Gaza war. Incidentally, we're in the 3-year anniversary, by the way, of Israel's assault on Gaza that killed 1,400 civilians, including 500 children. And early on, there were hundreds of Palestinian casualties, overwhelmingly civilians, and eventually there were 2 soldiers who were killed. And the Washington Post ran this headline, where the main text reads, 2 Israeli soldiers killed in Gaza clash. And the hundreds of civilians come a little bit later, much less emphasized. Obviously, that is one degree of how a headline like this is problematic. But if you look a little closer, you'll notice that even at the bottom, where the hundreds of people who are getting killed do get mentioned, it says death toll tops 330 as Hamas militants, it reads a little bit farther down for some reason, it's cut off here, step up attacks or something to that effect. So you leave the reader with the impression, if somebody is not going to read the article in full and figure out the details, you leave them with the impression that it's actually Hamas attacks that are causing hundreds of Israeli casualties, when the reality is it is actually Israeli indiscriminate attacks on civilian areas that are leaving hundreds of Palestinian casualties. Now, another aspect of this is also, it affects what starting points of conflicts are pointed out. So it was widely stated around the time of that war 3 years ago that the starting point was the kidnapping of 3 Israeli settlers and their murder. And that was supposedly the starting point which led to eventually the full-scale bombing of Gaza. The day before these 3 settlers were killed, a Palestinian man and a 10-year-old child were killed in an Israeli airstrike. But it doesn't occur to anyone to think of that as a potential starting point for a cycle of violence, because there is conditioning, internalized conditioning in the media, that the narrative is Palestinians attack and Israel responds. So whenever we're talking about the kind of loss of human life that justifies war, it's typically Israeli loss of human life, not Palestinian loss of human life. Now, why does this happen? Where does this bias come from? I think it comes from 2 primary places. The first one is that American corporate media just naturally follows American political power. And when you have a situation in the US where support for Israel is a bipartisan issue in both the Republican and the Democratic Party establishments, then it only makes sense that the media would start adopting and internalizing that bias. A second aspect is the fact that many so-called pro-Israel organizations brag about the fact that they mobilize against media outlets whenever they perceive the coverage to be unfair to Israel. And you have in some cases, like an organization called Honest Reporting, where they bragged about shifting coverage on Fox News in one instance, where it went from covering the issue accurately, conveying the facts, to actually conveying inaccurate and incorrect facts. This has happened on more than one occasion. So these are a couple of the factors that actually influence media coverage. And I think that a third problem in the portrayal of this conflict in mainstream media outlets is direct Israeli government propaganda. You know, Orwellian discourse is quite a problem, and frankly, we're getting a good taste of it right now with the Trump administration as well, where Trump claims his crowds at the inauguration were bigger than anybody else's. People look at him and say, that's fake news. Then the media reports something accurate, and he looks back at them and says, you're fake news. And suddenly, for the average viewer, you're looking at this, and all you see is people exchanging accusations that news is fake, and the average viewer loses interest in actually figuring out what is actually true and what is false. And I think that you're seeing something very similar here with Israeli government influence on media coverage. So, for example, I'm sure many of you are familiar, which is at this point a standard talking point, that the reason why so many Palestinian civilians were killed in the Gaza war was allegedly because Hamas uses them as human shields. You can hardly talk about this with anybody who wants to talk about the Gaza war without bringing up that talking point. There's a small problem. There's zero evidence for that. Zero. Human rights organizations say that Hamas operated in civilian areas. That is absolutely true. That type of operation does increase the risk to civilians, but at the same time, that's the sort of thing you'd expect from a small militia that doesn't have an army that can confront another army, no air force, none of that stuff. So that's basically a natural outcome of the imbalance of power, that you'll have one side operating in civilian areas. Human shields has a very specific definition. It is coercing civilians to be put in front of you in danger and preventing them from leaving in order to prevent the enemy from shooting at you. Do you know who does that? The Israeli military does. And that is very well documented by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and UN reports. And somehow the narrative is entirely flipped on this. In 2005, the Israeli Supreme Court, knowing that the Israeli military uses Palestinian civilians frequently as human shields when they go on military operations, said, we've had enough of this, this can't go on, we are banning the practice of human shields. The IDF and the Defense Ministry objected to that ruling, and they went and challenged it in court. They lost. So officially, as a matter of law, there is now a ban on the Israeli military using Palestinian civilians as human shields. But nevertheless, the practice actually continues. And there are cases where in that particular war 3 years ago, a young Palestinian boy was also used as a human shield. And when they were caught doing it, Human Rights Watch described the punishment the soldier received as a slap on the wrist. So what you're actually seeing is an encouragement of the use of Palestinians as human shields, because they can get away with it, because it's a tactic that the Israeli military actually wants to employ. Another aspect of this is Benjamin Netanyahu, whose government is actually engaged in a level of ethnic cleansing in the occupied territories. There are ongoing home demolitions in East Jerusalem. But yet he gets on YouTube and says, the Palestinians want to ethnically cleanse the Jews from the Palestinian areas. It's an outrageous claim. Opposition to settlers taking over Palestinian land is not a desire for ethnic cleansing. That's just an insane way to frame it. But Netanyahu says, you're committing ethnic cleansing. Then a Palestinian official gets on TV and says, you, the Israelis, are committing ethnic cleansing. And what does the average viewer think? Okay, they're exchanging accusations. Who cares? Just change the channel and move on to something else. The Arabs and the Jews are going to fight each other forever. You create a level of disinterest in what is actually taking place because you can't figure out what is actually true. And then there is the issue of simplified talking points, effective Israeli government talking points. That, it's a lot easier to throw a rock in a river than to figure out how to get the rock out of the river. And there are talking points that appeal on an instinctive level to the average viewer, that they're very easy to throw out there, even though they're completely factually incorrect. And to demonstrate that they are factually incorrect ends up taking a lot of effort. One example is the talking point that Israel left the Gaza Strip and all they got in return was rockets. Every time you talk about Israel not conceding, but actually returning some of the land that they illegally occupied to the Palestinians, the immediate talking point is, well, we gave them Gaza back and all we got was rockets. Now, as a matter of fact, Israel never left Gaza. They withdrew settlers out of the Gaza Strip. They pushed them into the West Bank. They continued the occupation of the West Bank and the expansion of settlements there. They continued to place the Gaza Strip under a siege. For a while there, they were not even allowing soda pop and bags of chips and cookies into the Gaza Strip as a means of coercing the civilian population there into changing its political behavior. Israel carries out frequent bombings of the Gaza Strip. They shoot at fishermen when they try to fish off of the coast. They don't allow an airport to exist there. And they shoot at Palestinians when they get a little bit too close to the border. And in many cases, they've killed unarmed civilians when no combatants were around. All of that is documented by human rights organizations. So to explain all of this, that requires a very long sentence. When you compare what I just described to the sentence of, we left the Gaza Strip and they shot rockets at us, it's a much shorter clip. And when you're in a TV debate situation where you have to speak in sound bites, their sound bite is much more effective than the one you would have to do to explain what is actually wrong with what they're saying. In light of all this, the question is then, how do you fight back against that bias? I think every person who cares about this has a skill set, and I think that it ultimately comes down to what each individual thinks their skill set is and what they can contribute. I think that I have a particularly good skill set in terms of debates and in terms of making videos. I've studied multimedia graphic design. So what I do with a lot of my time is actually create short videos that I post on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook that debunk individual Israeli myths about random things. Incitement to violence, human shields, apartheid, what have you, all of that stuff. And now that I'm working with the Arab American Institute, we're taking that skill set to the Institute, and I really recommend that you guys follow the Arab American Institute on social media. You'll be getting a lot of these videos that you might actually be very, very useful to you as well. But then it becomes up to each individual person in this room and anywhere else about what skill set do you have and how can you contribute. That's really up to you to figure out. One thing that I would say is we need more Palestinian voices in mainstream American media coverage. And media outlets should hear about it when they're covering our issues and we're not included in the discussion. So there were breaks during that Gaza war 3 years ago where people like Yusuf Munayyer and Noor Arakat were actually on mainstream outlets. They were on MSNBC and CNN. But that still is much more rare than it should be. The fact that we've had a few breaks here and there does not change the fact that we're still grossly underrepresented when topics of the Middle East actually come up. Another thing that I think is important is learning debate skills, and I would like to distinguish that from knowing what is actually happening in the conflict. The person who wins the debate is not the person who knows more. You can get a professor who knows everything there is to know about every last detail, and they're not necessarily the person who's going to perform the best in a TV debate situation. There's a way to make sure that the conversation happens on the ground that focuses on what is actually important and what is driving the conflict. I'll give you an example. I was invited on an Israeli channel not long ago to talk about the infighting between the Palestinians over the Gaza electricity situation. What do you think of what Mahmoud Abbas is doing and the PA cutting money and all that stuff? Even if you make all the best points there are to make, I think this is a very important conversation, by the way, for Palestinians to have, for people who care about Palestine to have, in an open setting like this where we have a lot of time. These are important topics to talk about. But when you're invited on a TV program where you're speaking for a couple of minutes, to me, I think it does a disservice to focus on that particular aspect of it, and I think it's much more important to shift the blame to where it actually belongs. Yes, there is Palestinian infighting, but the problem is the siege on Gaza. That's the driving force of why there's a humanitarian catastrophe at this point in the first place. And all you have to do is switch things around. If Hamas had placed Israel under siege, and Tel Aviv was dark because they could not afford to pay their electricity bill, because Hamas prevents Israel from doing commerce with any outside country, would anybody be talking about infighting between Israeli groups and political organizations? Or would everybody be saying, look at this monstrous siege that Hamas has imposed on Israel, it must end? So I think it's important to know where to take the conversation, not just to know all the facts and dispute every last detail that is said that is incorrect. And the last thing I would recommend is to get out of echo chambers. I think we have a tendency to speak to ourselves a lot. We come to talks like this where a lot of us are sympathetic to the same issues. And whether you're talking about education or complaining, it's really important that we start reaching out to the main focus always ought to be a mainstream audience. What can I say and do to make sure that this message is going beyond people who are already sympathetic and reach people who don't know? You're never going to reach the other side, right? That's done. But the American public, by and large, is really misinformed about this issue. Now, there's progress. We're making a lot of progress on that front. You see it in opinion polls. It's becoming increasingly also a partisan issue. The Trump administration has worked very hard to make sure that's the case as well. So you're seeing a lot more liberal, democratic-leaning populations, when you do polling, are getting it. They're much less down with the occupation. They're not okay with settlement expansion. They oppose it. They think there should be punitive measures for it. And that's increasing. At the same time, it hasn't reached the political establishment level yet. When you look at, Bernie Sanders attempted to, and he did a great job, but at the end of the day, when it comes down to the party platform, Bernie Sanders' efforts to push more progressive language into the platform was successful on virtually every front, with the exception of this issue. So you can see that there's still a lot of resistance in the political establishment about dealing with this issue correctly and fairly. And I think that getting out of the echo chamber also extends to complaining about media bias. Instead of us telling each other how frustrated we are that media coverage is inaccurate and missed this and didn't do that, I think these media outlets should be hearing from us. Every time they cover an issue in a way that you think is inaccurate or unfair, they should get an email from you. People should, write letters to the editor, write op-eds, push for that messaging to actually penetrate mainstream media. And I know that social media is a great tool. It has democratized the way we communicate, but I still think that we need to pursue serious efforts to get mainstream corporate media coverage on this issue to be better than it is. I guess I'll leave it here, and we can do a Q&A from here. Thank you.
Hi. I raise this question every time I hear it, and if I'm going to criticize media, I guess I should criticize our own media. Every time you talk about that we actually got out of Gaza, that Israel never got out of Gaza, that they're still there, I wonder why nobody raises the possibility, and I think it's an actual fact, but it might be a possibility, that the only reason Israel left Gaza was so that they could commit genocide there, which is what they tried to do several times. And even if you don't say it that way, because we don't know that that's a fact, you can always say there is the possibility that. So, and that's our media.
Let me say this about. Do you want to take multiple questions and I'll answer them at once? Mm-hmm. Okay, sure.
Hi, my name is Muhammad Arusan. I also intern here at DC, and my question is regarding the BDS movement towards Israel, where you had Senator Bernie Sanders say that he would be opposed to BDS, and there's an upcoming bill in the House, in the Senate, where they were making it illegal for any acts of any BDS towards Israel, make it punishable by prison time and a massive fine. I just want to know your thoughts about that.
Thank you very much. I especially appreciated when you mentioned in your speech things that people could do. And obviously there are a lot more than what you mentioned. For example, you left out letters and meetings with members of Congress. I wonder, perhaps others in the audience have suggestions, because this would be a great idea, place to get more ideas about things that could be done to deal with these various biases and so on.
Sure. So I'll start with the first one on Gaza. Let me say that if you look down deep at the legal definition of the word genocide, one can make a case. But at the same time, the word genocide to me is inflammatory, and what it brings to mind for the average person is something that is comparable to what happened in the Holocaust. You're talking about the mass murder of large groups of people in a very direct way. And for that reason, I personally prefer not to use the word genocide for what is happening in Gaza. I think what's happening in Gaza is absolutely monstrous. It's unacceptable. You're destroying an entire society. There are estimates that Gaza will not be livable in a few years. At the same time, I personally prefer not to use the word genocide because I think it invokes, But my personal read on what is happening in Gaza is I think that Israel is invested in making sure Gaza fails, precisely for that talking point. So they can always point to it and say, when you give Palestinians land, this is what they do with it. They're failing. There's no point in conceding any more territory to them. And so I think that that's where that investment comes from. That's why the siege is in place. That's why the bombings are in place. That's why forcing the Palestinians in a state of despair is in place. And whenever you put a population under that kind of pressure, it is only inevitable that eventually they react with some, you're essentially breeding extremism within the Gaza Strip based on how you treat that entire population, basically, and treat Gaza as an open-air prison. So, yeah, I think that the fact that what Israel is doing in Gaza is by design and it's to further Israel's political agenda, I think that is absolutely accurate, and it's something that every person of conscience should be fighting against. On the BDS thing, I think this is one of the biggest battles that we have coming up, and it's absolutely crucial. On the bright side, it's not just your typical defenders of Palestinian rights who are standing up against this. Now you have the ACLU, the single largest civil rights organization in the US, taking a very, very strong stance against this bill because they recognize they're not doing it because of Palestinians. They're doing it because undermining the right of American citizens to boycott whoever they want to boycott is an infringement on their free expression and the First Amendment. And I think that that's a huge tool that we have to capitalize on. And I don't know what the odds of the bill actually passing or not passing are at this point, but the fact that we have major forces who are actually willing to stand against this with us, I think this is a moment that we do not waste, and we have to actually mobilize against it in a very, very serious way. My understanding is the voting on it might come in the fall, but now is the time to start organizing against it, and I think it's absolutely crucial. It's an unacceptable bill. And the last question on congressional...
Well, it was additional things that could be done to fight against these biases and misrepresentations. I mentioned letters and meetings with members of Congress, but also engaging with friends at church, at the mosque, wherever and so on. And with when people say things that are clearly not accurate, without being antagonistic or overly aggressive, just saying, well, look, but there's another side to this and so on, and you should be aware of this and that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question about it. Every word is true. I didn't mention Congress specifically because we were talking about media bias, but I think advocacy on the political front is absolutely crucial. We have a tendency to get easily frustrated because the political establishment right now is not where we would like them to be. And so I get how disheartened people might get sometimes of thinking, oh, it's hopeless, why bother, who cares? But, progress happens very, very slowly, and you have to play the long game. When you look at our opponents, people, like when Obama says or does something that AIPAC doesn't like, they don't lash out and say, that's it, we're boycotting the political system, we're not engaging with the administration anymore. And I think that we have to learn a lesson from that. Yes, the political establishment is not where it needs to be. Members of Congress are very uneducated about this, and some who are educated about it will tell you sometimes privately that the reason why they're not taking the correct stance is precisely because they're afraid of the pressure that they would come under if they were to. So I think you play the long game, you continue building those relationships, you invest in them. You don't go to Congress just when something terrible happens and it's a case of emergency. You build and establish those relationships so that you can actually leverage them when time comes and an emergency actually breaks out. So yeah.
Congressmen appreciate when their constituents call them on something and say, this is of concern to me.
Absolutely.
It's estimated that for every person who contacts a member of Congress, there are 200 other people in the district who have similar feelings. Mm-hmm. These people all vote.
Yep, absolutely.
Regarding sending letters to the newspapers or the mainstream media, I've written a few letters, but of course they never get published. But I have this feeling that whenever we have an article which is anti-Israel or anti-anything, then there is an outpouring the next day, and I usually watch for the next day to see how many letters actually are going to come and combat this. I get the feeling that whenever there is something which is anti-Israel, AIPAC has churning machines that says, okay, we're going to flood this newspaper with like 200 letters that are opposing to this article. Is there such a structure in here which is will tell the story of the Palestinians? Doesn't have to be, personally signed, just churning like 200 letters, flooding the media with it. Is there such a thing?
Yeah, sorry, I'll wait for a few more questions. Yeah. She's back there doing that.
Hi. As a professor of language, one thing I've noticed reading is that the passive voice is often used instead of the active voice in order to disguise agency. So you'll find 3 Palestinians were killed. Well, rather than Israelis killed 3 Palestinian soldiers. And it's very interesting how that's constantly used. The passive voice when it comes to Palestinian victims, but the active voice when it comes to Palestinians killed Israelis.
Hi, Mr. Baddar. A comment and a question. The comment is there is a very biased Republican press in this country, and I'll cite just 2 examples. John Batchelor and WMAL, that's a Rush Limbaugh station, very biased. The other one is David Brooks, who on the Israeli situation is very biased. My question to you is, Israeli Palestinians, those who serve in Knesset, those who serve in the police force, those who serve in the army, where are they getting caught in this issue? If I'm not mistaken, I thought I saw a couple of them were caught up in some of the violence, these Israeli Palestinians. So,
and I'm interested in your thoughts on the representation of Palestine and Israel over time on Google Maps.
All right. I guess I'll take a stab at some of these. On the letters to the editor, I'm not aware of any struggle. By the way, when the other side does it, it's not so centralized. Not everything comes out of AIPAC, but the organization that actually claims this most aggressively is an organization called CAMERA, the Committee for Middle East Accuracy Middle East Reporting in America, or something like that. And they basically brag about the fact that they can turn out hundreds of thousands of members to send those letters to the editor and so on. I'm not.
Is that true, or they just have copies of them?
I think they have a wide membership that participates, to the extent to which I'm not sure what the exact mechanism is, whether they distribute the letters to them and people edit them a little bit and send them on, or what exactly, but they do basically send out alerts to a very large membership who participate in this kind of pressure on media outlets. I'm not aware of any counter pressure like that, and I think it makes sense for people to start that kind of pressure, especially when we see really, they catch the once in a while mistake that was done. And for us, it's not that. We have constant coverage like this to be objecting to virtually every day of the week. Anytime there's a report in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that does not mention that Palestine is illegally occupied by Israel, I think that deserves to be noted. Nothing to add on the passive voice. I agree with you. It's a problem. In fact, not just passive and active, but sometimes it's also Palestinians die while Israelis are killed. You notice subtle. I don't think it's intentional. I don't think that a reporter is sitting there thinking, how can I make sure that this report comes out biased in some way? But I really think that the bias is internalized at this point. What I talked about earlier, this just natural public discourse sympathy and humanization of Israelis, that we see them as people who are like us, while the Palestinians are just these hordes of people who just die or live or whatever. I think that definitely contributes to that kind of sentiment. On Israeli Palestinians, their lives are slightly more comfortable than Palestinians living under occupation. They have plenty of rights. They're still second-class citizens, there's no question about it. And they have plenty of sympathy towards the Palestinians in the occupied territories who are getting the worst of Israeli policies, there's no question about it. But there's also a lot of incitement against Palestinian citizens of Israel, including the ones in the Knesset. Other members of the Knesset, the right-wingers, constantly accuse them of treason, want them expelled or arrested or all that stuff. So to me, they're every bit a part of the struggle for Palestinian rights as anybody else. Their situation specifically is a little different, but they're still part of that greater issue. I'm not sure what the latest is on Google Maps and Palestine. I know they took it out. I don't know what happened with it, so I'm sorry, I don't have an update on this. But Palestine is being erased in many ways. And the single most important way Palestine is being erased is actually physically on the ground, through home demolitions and clearing out of areas, and Bedouin villages being destroyed and new settlements being built on top of Palestinian territories. I think it's absolutely crucial to combat the erasure of Palestine in every form, and I think that this one is the single most compelling and important one. Did I miss any questions, or was that everyone's?
Omar, I have a question for you.
Sure.
So how would you address the question of Christian Zionists in the U.S., because their support is obviously very important, and the fact that, quite honestly, they're basically used as tools by Israelis to promote their own agenda. Just anybody that's visited Israel can tell there's a hierarchy even within Jews themselves. You have the black Jews who are at the very lowest, and then you have the white European origin Jews who are at the highest end of the totem pole. So, quite frankly, Israelis are not fond of Christians either, but yet they use them as tools for their own propaganda purposes. So how would you explain that to Americans here who are Christians and Zionists and that support the Israeli state?
I'm interested in the issue of genocide again, recognizing that it is a very inflammatory word, but when you describe what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, short of genocide, are there advantages in pointing out how those acts of oppression have also been delivered by other people to Jews in their history? And see if you can't appeal to the Jewish consciousness that those practices were terrible when they were done to Jews and therefore should be abhorred when they're done by Israelis to Palestinians.
Mike is coming.
Who is it that writes the headlines for the articles? Is it the author himself or herself, or is it done by someone else? And could the authors then, if they're taking a stance that's opposed to what you have up there as a headline, would they have the authority to request that the headline be changed?
We'll take one more.
Thank you. I have a twofold question for you. The first one is, I was at this seminar about a month ago, and there was a lot of discussion between the Arab world, the Muslim world, and the Palestinian world. And there was no general consensus as to what was the common theme and what shared values each one had. And I'm wondering as to whether this is lost as to who are the Palestinians and who represents them in the world scene. The second question I have is, you've talked about the US side, but isn't there a more receptive audience in the European Union? And therefore, why isn't that being leveraged as part of the overall strategy? Thank you.
So, let's take one more. Go ahead.
I was noting something that you said earlier about flipping the message, and it occurred to me that a lot of the situation in Israel-Palestine is very similar to the American movie Red Dawn. And if the narrative could be compared to that movie, you can easily see why the Palestinians are behaving like the characters in the movie that were the Wolverines in the mountains fighting back with primitive methodologies. And the invading force, if you present it the way the Western media does, that would be the way that this invading force would be presented back in their home country, but you couldn't possibly present it that way there.
All right, let me tackle these backwards. I think I've not seen Red Dawn, but I get the general idea of bringing it closer to home for people with stories that they can actually connect with. When I talk about Israeli settlements, I often bring up the example of, imagine if Russia or China had taken over California and started demolishing American homes and building Chinese or Russian homes in their place. Would Americans say that's okay? Obviously they would not. So I think anyways, analogies are always very, very useful. It's always good to bring it home to people in a way that they can understand. I agree with that. I think there are different, we can agree or disagree on any specific examples here or there, but the general idea I think is important. On the EU, I think there's plenty of efforts in the EU to actually get the BDS movement is growing over there. But to me, I think that ultimately the only country that is actually in a position to leverage Israel is the United States. Israel is the single largest recipient of U.S. military aid. They get more than $40 billion at this point over a period of 10 years. And it comes down to who is able to leverage Israel. And I think that the one country that is basically a patron to Israel is the country that is most able to coerce it to abide by international law and human rights law. So I think that this is where the effort ought to be focused. On the editor's headlines, I think the editor typically is the one that makes the final call. I've written many articles where I was really frustrated with the fact that the headline was not what I wanted it to be. And very often it goes after more inflammatory, like what can get clicks. That tends to be the primary driving force. And of course, sometimes people's, editors' biases can influence things. You can raise it certainly as somebody who's writing the piece, as a journalist or as a contributor, but at the end of the day, the final call is not yours, unfortunately. On the word genocide and the analogies there, again, I think it's about knowing your audience and knowing what your audience is receptive to. That to me is always the right framing. To an average person, the second you make Nazi comparisons, you've lost them, because there isn't an active death camp that Palestinians are going through at the hands of Israelis. And once that's not there, I think once you start making Nazi comparisons, you lose people. So I don't think that from a strategic point of view it's effective, and I don't think it's particularly accurate. But if a conversation between Jewish activists who are talking about this want to bring up the fact that, listen, the Palestinians are oppressed, we know what oppression is like, this is something we should talk about, I think that's a perfectly fair thing. Just for me as a Palestinian commentator on this, it's not something I'm particularly comfortable doing, and I just leave it to other people who are, if they are. And then on the issue of racism and Christian Zionism, I would separate these things. So there's racism within Israeli society. It's documented. There are lots of cases that are pretty egregious. But I would separate that a little bit from the issue of Christian Zionism in the US, in the sense that I think it's actually mutually exploitative. For apocalyptic evangelical Christian Zionists, they believe that Jesus will return when every last Jewish person in the world is gathered in Israel. So they're invested in supporting Israel from I can't even say that word anymore, an apocalyptic point of view. And crazy enough, their vision for the end of days is that all the Jews either convert to Christianity or they get slaughtered. That's the actual theology. But from Israel's perspective, they don't care what the end day theology is. As long as they're willing to support Israel in the meantime, they're happy to take on that support. And for me, if it's going to be an argument on theological grounds, that's something for Christian activists to do. I'm not a Christian. There are lots of Christians who are very active in support of Palestinian Christians in Bethlehem, whose the occupation affects them just as much as it affects any other Palestinian. So I think that there is a track to happen on the religious front. But for me personally, whenever these arguments come up, all I can say is I don't believe God is a real estate agent, first of all. And second of all, land distribution is not determined by holy books in the 21st century. It's determined by international law. And international law is very clear about the fact that the occupation is illegal. And that's where I'd leave that.
Thanks, Omar. That was an excellent presentation. Just in terms of a couple of resources people were asking about, there is a group that writes action alerts in response to media bias. It's called Right for Justice in Palestine. It's at rightalert@outlook.com, but good follow up. And just in terms of maybe a couple of resources, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, imeu.org, is an excellent place that puts out the Palestinian narrative.
Agreed. IMEU is excellent.
And one other idea is it's possible to go to Palestine, and there's a group that organizes trips there. It's called Interfaith Peace Builders, ifpb.org. So those are 3 resources.
Yep. Thank you. Just passing it around. There were 2 more hands up earlier down here. Yep.
Thanks. So on the issue of erasure, I just wanted to hear your thoughts about how we could make nonviolent resistance, Palestinian nonviolent resistance, more prominent, because it seems that all people are interested in are violent resistance. And so how can we make that more?
Another question?
Up front, right here. Yeah. Your microphone's coming your way.
Mine wasn't a question, but two people said that there's other ways of spreading the word. And he mentioned interfaith peace builders. When I got back from my trip, I wrote basically a 20-page paper and day-by-day description and circulated it among all my neighbors. And people were talking about that for months and passing it on to their friends. Now, I don't know how many converts I got, but at least they talk a good storm. The other big thing my husband and I did when we were a little younger was have parties where the guests never knew that this is why we were doing it, but where we were able to mix Zionist Jews, relatives, friends, whatever, with Palestinians. And most of the Palestinians had worked with Jews before, but the Jews had never met Palestinians. And over the years, we did get a few converts that way. So anything you could do informally like that, and not even let people know why you're doing it. I mean, when I spread that paper around, people had, asked me, how was your trip to Israel? And I said it was Palestine. But it was, just like, how was your trip to Bermuda? They weren't expecting anything like what I gave them.
Yeah.
So.
Anyone else? That's it? All right. Nothing to add there. Thank you. That was, I think all the resources you mentioned were important. And on the nonviolent resistance front, I think it is absolutely, you're right in that, in general, this is not only a matter of bias, that nonviolent resistance of any kind is going to get less media attention than violence, because violence is louder and sexier, and that's what news outlets are out to get. They want clicks and eyeballs and so on. But I also think that there's a second tier here, which is that Israel is very uncomfortable with nonviolent resistance. And I think it tries to crush it and slander it and so on. We look at the effort of the Palestinian prisoners who were on hunger strike just a couple months ago, not long ago. Who knows what the actual details are of Barghouti, whether he ate or didn't eat or whatever. But you can see why Israel is investing so much in undermining that narrative, because they don't know what to do with Palestinian resistance. They know what to do with violent resistance. They can crush it because Israel has the military might to actually crush it, and they're very comfortable in the violent arena. And once it comes to nonviolence, it's the kind of thing where they've got no way to respond. And so they resort to slanders and efforts to bring it down in any way possible. And I think that there are lots of groups that are doing excellent work on this. I would recommend Just Vision. They do a lot of, excellent. There you go. Follow Just Vision too. They do excellent work. And I think you guys have a film coming up soon too, right? Yep. So, I don't have anything beyond the fact that I think it's something that everybody should get involved in, is highlighting these efforts when they happen. You always hear, where is the Palestinian Gandhi? That's why the Palestinians are losing. But there really is no shortage of Palestinian nonviolent activists who are engaged in nonviolent resistance. And that's on us. We have to make sure that these stories get out.
The committee to end the Israeli occupation.
They changed their name, the Committee for Palestinian Rights now.
Exactly. Could you talk to the thinking behind that rather important shift? And Mr. Munayer, as you know, is the executive director of that organization. Could you say something about that?
It seems to me like a niche thing to talk about. I don't know if it's necessarily useful for anybody who's not familiar with the organization, but it's the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. They've done absolutely incredible work. I think, in my view, I was on, just full disclosure, I was on their steering committee a long time ago, back in the mid-2000s, and they are pretty much the sort of single coordinator of Palestine activism across the U.S. Because the focus on ending the occupation was too narrow, and because we're shifting right now into a space where it really is unclear whether the two-state solution is going to survive or not, it seemed much more comprehensive to talk about all Palestinian rights, not just ending the occupation, but also refugee rights, the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and so on. So they changed their name to the Palestinian Campaign for Palestinian Rights, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. This way it's much more encompassing and comprehensive. But I think that they're a really good organization to actually connect with. If you want any resources, if you're in different towns around the country or anything like that, and you want an organization that can actually provide you with resources and connect you with other like-minded people in your area, I think they're an absolutely excellent resource.